Here is Pennonia Csillant Nettle, a green ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
This is a fun green that really keeps you on your toes as you change pen and paper. It does have a ton of tone variation almost constantly as you change your pen, so you're going to need to check it before just going with it. There is, in general, good shading, but it does lose shading in its darkest tones. Now, on non-fountain pen friendly paper, this is the third time I've tried saying that, it still performs well, but still often has a bunch of tone shifting. Despite the unpredictability, it always looks good on the page and certainly needs more attention in the fountain pen community. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is a Lamy 2000.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the lightest tone that we're going to get. It's very easy to read on the page still. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade very well, dear me, on the third line, where the D on the downstroke right side gets quite a bit darker, lightens a little bit into the E, lightens some more into the A, darkens a little bit with the R. Now me starts a little bit lighter on the M, but then becomes very dark. It does this sort of shading very frequently and always looks good. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is the darkest tone that we're going to get, far darker than it was with the soft fine. It does not feather, does not spread, does not shade. It is so dark it might almost pass as a black. I'm going to call it green black. It might pass to someone that doesn't know, but in person you definitely see an undertone of a something. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, darker than it was with the soft fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade about like it does on the soft fine, where we get some darker areas. If you take a look at Knights on this first line, the NI is lighter than the GHT, but the S lightens just a little bit. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, still darker than it was with the soft fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, not a huge standout feature of what's going on here, but it does give a little bit of shading. It's not lost here. Look at quite lost on the first line, where the Q is darker than the UI. The T gets very dark and that E is a nice midtone. Now lost starts as a little bit darker, more a midtone, becomes lighter with the S, goes back to that midtone with the T. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 6 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Got kind of a grassy green kind of look to it. Now it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread, and come, it definitely shades. Look at come on the first line, where the top of the C of the first come is lighter than the rest of the word, where it darkened quite a bit. The second one, the CO, is quite a bit lighter than the ME at the end. As I said, it does shade. It's not the most standout feature of it. I think that's really the tone in itself. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It's not so much a green black as it is a very dark green here, with no feathering, with no spread, with a couple of moments of shading. You don't get to say that it doesn't shade. Look at don't on the second line, where the D is darker than the ON and the T at the end darkens up again. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade here, but it is still giving a great tone on the page. Really, if you like green inks and don't like shading, this ink and paper together with this nib, perfect. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, just a tiny bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not shade. It spread. Meanwhile, it does shade some, not huge, but some. Look at meanwhile on the second line, where the MEA are a little bit darker than that N. It darkened just a little bit there. It lightened up again for the W, but the H got darker while the I lightened, the LE at the end very dark. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade better than it did on the Clairefontaine, I think. There's not mountains of it looking at this, but there are certainly quite a few areas. Look at mountains looking on the second line, where the M is darker than the OU, the NT darken up a little bit, especially that T. The AI lighten again. The N at the end gets a bit darker. Now looking, the L is dark. The O's, like eyes, lightened up in the middle. The K got very dark, but the ing at the end got light again. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, just as dark as it was on the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. I'm going to say that while it's dark like the Clairefontaine, it's just a shade off, and you really do see that it's a super dark green here. I think the tone of the paper is showing some effect, so maybe a little a little translucent as an ink. Shading, none to be found. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, about the tone that it was with the broad on the Clairefontaine. Now it does not feather and it does not spread. It's not shading here on this paper. On the non-fountain pen friendly papers, it's less common to get some of the shading that this ink can offer. It still looks great and would be a joy to read back. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, darker than it was on the Clairefontaine, not as dark as the medium was on the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does have a very, very light seasoning of shading that goes on. If you take a look at parts on the first line, where the PAR is lighter than the TS at the end, the underneath it, the T is lighter than the he it ends with, and Balin's on the third line is mostly one tone, except the apostrophe S at the end, that gets darker. Looking at the back of the page, you see with the broad and the medium, it got quite deep into the paper. It never bled through touching the page underneath, so I wouldn't use these for the writing on both sides. Strangely, the wet fine and the soft fine both did perfectly good, and you can continue your notes back here. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. But what we're looking at here is the quad rule, and it stands out against the quad rule even in the lightest tone that this ink is going to give. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, not as dark as it was on the Clairefontaine, actually quite a bit lighter to where it is very much a super dark green, but doesn't pass that point to where it looks like a black green. Now, no feather, no spread, and it does shade here, where it didn't do that at all in many of the other papers from this pen. Here we are getting some shading. I mean, take a look at Thorin on the first line, where the TH is very dark. The Orin at the end lighten up quite a bit. Had on the second line, very dark H, lighter ad at the end. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, only has a light peppering of shading throughout some of the writing. Look at they on the second line, where the T is lighter than the H. The H, it lightens coming out of the H into the E and the beginning of the Y, all lighter, darker during that downstroke of the Y at the end. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. After going through this, I do find some spots. Look at after going on the second line, where the top of the A is darker than the bottom of the A. Going into the F, it's a nice lighter tone, very dark with the TE. Top of the R is a little bit lighter than the bottom of the R at the end. Now going starts lighter with the GOIN, but the G at the end, very dark. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is 3 Oysters, Black Moss. Here is Ackerman, their number 25 Denoid Green. Here is Diatramentis Document Green. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Green number 2. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is just a little bit darker, but flatter than it was on the Clairefontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade, probably better than it did on the Clairefontaine. They couldn't do a better match here. Look at they could on the third line, where the T is lighter than the hey at the end. Now could starts lighter on the COU. The L darkens just a little bit as it works its way to that D that does get darker at the end. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade, it does stand out on the quad rule as the soft fine did. It's doing a great job here. It's definitely a great ink. Look at indefinitely on the third line, where the I is darker than the ND. It's during the downstroke of the D, it gets darker into the E, it gets a nice mid-tone. Keeps that mid-tone through most of the F, where it lightens up into the INE. Now, the Tilly at the end, quite a bit darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread. It does have a very light bit of shading. So this paper doesn't always bring through the shading, except in this case it really is. Look at except on the first line, where the EXC are lighter than the E, the next E that becomes a nice mid-tone into the P, and the T at the end, very dark. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does have a light peppering of shading throughout it, and it does stand out great against the quad rule, making this really good for a student to use for their notes. Looking at the back of the page, the student's going to be very happy that they can continue their notes back here because there's no bleeding and no ghosting. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page. Here is Krishna Sunburst. Here is Private Reserve Purple Haze. Here is Roher and Klinger Document Black. Here is Mont Blanc Burgundy Red. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. Just a little bit though. This is very usable where it's at. You know, the feathering's there because I'm used to looking for it. But if you weren't, you might not even really see it, and the non-fountain pen friendly or the non-fountain pen user won't even notice it. There's even some shading that goes on here, which hasn't been the case, but in the past meant you might see some bleeding. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. It does not shade. Now the feathering and the spread, it comes down to, is this usable as we see it on the page? And I think it is. I think we have a good combination, and if you wanted to use this ink with a wet pen on this paper, I don't think it's going to be too many problems. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, does spread, does not shade. It does pass the usability test. It can be used on this paper without it being the end of the world. You're just not getting as good tones and as good shading as on some of the other papers. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium. A little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now it does feather and it does spread. It does not shade. However, I think it feathered the least of all of these, and it wasn't that I even thought the feathering on the others was bad. This is a very usable ink. It puts a very nice tone down on the paper. Super happy what it's doing on copy paper. Looking at the back of the page, you can see how deep this ink gets into the paper. There's no taking notes back here because you'll lose both sides. However, it did not bleed through touching the page underneath. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The soft fine is the lightest tone and shades well and is still easy to read on the page. Now the wet fine is super dark and doesn't shade. The medium is lighter than the wet fine, and it shades almost to as dark as the wet fine did. The medium is lighter than the medium, but darker than the soft fine. Did I say medium? The broad is lighter than the medium, but darker than the soft fine, and it does tend to still shade. Now, my first instinct says the medium flow medium because of the great tone and beautiful shading. Yet, the wet fine really draws my eye the most. No, demands my attention on the page. So I have to choose that wet fine or a wet to very wet pen, regardless of its nib size. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.